Good morning, everyone. My name is Victor Cha. I'm the Senior Advisor and Career Chair here at CSIS and Professor at Georgetown. And on behalf of Ambassador Armitage, John Hamre, and everyone here at CSIS, we want to welcome you here this morning for what should be a very interesting day-long series of discussions about critical issues regarding Korea at a very critical time. My role this morning is to introduce our keynote speaker, Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy. This, as many of you know, is the first day back from recess, but Congresswoman Murphy was kind enough to join us this morning. We were talking backstage. They have a very full schedule over the next 12 days, and so we're especially grateful that she was able to join us this morning. Congresswoman Murphy represents Florida's 7th Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives. She currently serves on the House Armed Services Committee and the House Small Business Committee, where she serves as ranking member on the Subcommittee on Contracting and Workforce. Previously, Congresswoman Murphy was a businesswoman and college instructor after serving as a national security specialist in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, where she received numerous awards for her distinguished service, including the Secretary of Defense Medal for Exceptional Civilian Service. She worked on a range of security issues from counterterrorism to foreign military relations to strategic planning for the Defense Department. Prior to her public service, she was a strategy consultant at Deloitte. Congresswoman Murphy, and this is very important, holds an MS in Foreign Service degree from Georgetown University and a BA in economics from College of William and Mary. So ladies and gentlemen, if you could please join me in welcoming Congresswoman Murphy for her remarks this morning.
Thank you, and thank you to CSIS and the Korea Foundation for inviting me to speak. I'm really honored to be here this morning, and especially given recent events on the Korean Peninsula. I don't think that this event could have been more timely. And Victor, thank you for that warm introduction. In addition to serving as a senior advisor at CSIS, as he mentioned, he's the director of Asian Studies at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, which is where I received my master's degree. And Victor is a terrific teacher and an even better public servant. And I'm really hopeful that his distinguished career in government will soon have another chapter. I also hope that Professor Cha is not grading my performance today. And if he is, I hope I do better than that B+ that was my average in grad school. So for the benefit of the audience here and online, let me briefly reintroduce myself. My name is Stephanie Murphy, and I'm a first-term member of Congress. I was born in Vietnam, and I came to the United States as a refugee with my family several years after the fall of Saigon in 1975. I'm honored to represent a district in Central Florida that includes Orlando and the northern suburbs. And I'm also a member of the House Armed Services Committee, where I serve on the Subcommittee for Readiness and the Subcommittee for Emerging Threats and Capabilities. In addition, along with Congressman Seth Moulton from Massachusetts and Congressman Jimmy Panetta from California, I co-chair the House Democratic Caucus's National Security Task Force. So the purpose of this recently established task force is to help Democrats in Congress propose strong, smart, and strategic national security policies, and to support the current administration when it advances foreign policies that comport with our nation's core interests and values, and to vigorously oppose the administration when it proposes policies that undermine those interests and values. You know, as leaders of the task force, we don't really see any value in reflexively opposing the administration, nor any more value in blindly supporting them. So I think it's about being fair and presenting smart and strong policies that work for this country. Before coming to Congress, I worked in a variety of roles as a civilian employee at the Department of Defense, where my primary region of focus was the Asia-Pacific region. And although I identify as a moderate Democrat in Congress, at DoD, I staffed 2 secretaries of defense who were appointed by a Republican president, Donald Rumsfeld and Robert Gates. I can't tell you how different those experiences were. I am a firm and almost fanatical believer in the old-fashioned maxim that to the greatest extent possible, politics should stop at the water's edge. And despite the partisan divide in Washington today, I continue to cling to this principle with a sense of determination and, at this point, quite frankly, desperation. In my brief framing remarks, I'd like to underscore the importance of the alliance between the United States and South Korea, to identify what I believe are the two main challenges to this alliance, and to offer some personal views from my perspective in Congress regarding how these challenges can be addressed. So let me begin with a few words about the alliance itself. It has become something of a cliche for government officials to assert that the relationship between two nations is built on common interest and common values. But in the case of the U.S. and South Korea, this statement, however trite it might sound, is true. But of course, it goes well beyond that. This alliance is special because it was built in battle, forged in fire, and shaped by shared sacrifice. Between 1950 and 1953, the citizens of our two nations fought and often fell side by side to repel North Korea's invasion of South Korea and to preserve South Korea's very existence. In 1953, following the armistice, we signed a mutual defense treaty that commits each country to come to the other's defense if attacked. And in the decades since, South Korea has evolved from a dictatorship to democracy, from a largely underdeveloped country to an economic powerhouse. And the U.S. has been consistently there to lend a helping hand through the provision of economic and security support. And there are currently over 28,000 U.S. troops stationed in South Korea to help defend our ally. But make no mistake about it, South Korea's success over the years is attributable, first and foremost, to the talent, ingenuity, and grit of the South Korean people and their leaders. Put differently, South Korea's remarkable rise, like so many consumer products the world has come to depend on, was made in South Korea. Products like the phones I see many of you using to fact-check my speech. Because our two nations fought together in a war that has never really ended, and because our service members continue to stand together along perhaps the most dangerous border in the world, our relationship is the furthest thing from transactional, temporary, or tactical. Instead, it's authentic, deeply personal, and resilient, likely to endure despite the occasional setbacks, tensions, and differences of opinion that are inevitable between any partnership between proud, sovereign, and democratic nations. At the same time, I believe a warning is in order. The proven depth and durability of our security and economic relationship should not breed complacency. A strong alliance, like a strong marriage, is not self-sustaining. Just ask my husband. It requires patient and persistent upkeep by officials in both nations. It should never, ever be taken for granted. So let me now turn to identify what I see as the two broad challenges to the U.S.-South Korea alliance and to outline a few thoughts on how each challenge should be confronted to maximize the chance of success. The first and most obvious challenge is the one posed by the increasingly belligerent, unpredictable, and dangerous regime in North Korea, the alliance's original raison d'etre. As everyone in this room knows painfully well, North Korea has now conducted 6 nuclear tests since October 2006, each one a violation of international law. The last 4 tests were conducted under the current leader, Kim Jong-un. And this past weekend, North Korea carried out its latest detonation of a nuclear device, one that appears to have a vastly more powerful yield than the device it tested back in September 2016. This is a profoundly dangerous, defiant, and destabilizing event. And as expected, the test has generated verbal condemnation from the international community, including China and Russia. But it's too early to say whether these strong words will be followed by strong actions. And if so, what those actions will entail, and whether or not they'll make any difference in altering North Korea's strategic calculus. Meanwhile, North Korea continues to develop and test missile delivery systems of increasing range and sophistication, having already conducted approximately 16 separate tests this year alone. Tests conducted in July led the UN Security Council, including China and Russia, to vote unanimously to tighten existing sanctions and to impose strict new sanctions on Pyongyang, which is certainly cause for cautious optimism. However, it remains to be seen whether these new sanctions will be adequately enforced, especially by Beijing, who accounts for upwards of 85% of North Korea's international trade. It also remains to be seen whether the Security Council will agree to strengthen these sanctions even further in light of North Korea's latest nuclear test. More generally, it's unclear what precise impact sanctions will have on North Korea's economy and on the regime's inclination, if any, to negotiate a nuclear freeze or reversal in exchange for some degree of sanctions relief. In the short term, North Korea responded to the new sanctions in its typical fashion, firing a missile last month that flew over Japan. And of course, North Korea proceeded with its latest nuclear test in the face of broad international opposition. The reality is that we are now in truly uncharted territory, and we've not yet cracked the code on how to influence decision-making in Pyongyang. North Korea's evident goal is to develop an arsenal of nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles that can reliably hit the U.S. territory of Guam, the U.S. state of Hawaii, and eventually the U.S. mainland. According to conventional wisdom, Kim Jong-un's primary reason for pursuing this capability is to avoid the fate that befell leaders like Saddam Hussein in Iraq and Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, to deter invasion by outside forces and therefore ensure regime survival. This rationale naturally bewilders policymakers in the United States and other like-minded countries. We may detest the regime in Pyongyang, but we regard North Korea's relentless progress in its nuclear and missile programs as the sole behavior that could compel the international community to take action that would result in regime change or collapse in North Korea. From this perspective, North Korea seems to be making a fundamental miscalculation regarding what's in its own best interests, and its provocative conduct could bring about the exact result, regime extinction, that Pyongyang seeks above all to avoid. And this is the conundrum that lies at the heart of the debate over what to do about North Korea. How do we get Kim Jong-un to conclude that a negotiation leading to denuclearization is the best and indeed the only way to ensure his regime survival? As Victor has argued, North Korea has another, less obvious goal in pursuing nuclear missiles capable of reaching the United States, and that is to weaken the U.S.-South Korea alliance that we're all gathered here today to discuss. Specifically, he asserts that North Korea seeks to threaten the U.S. homeland in order to undercut the credibility of the United States' extended deterrence guarantee to South Korea under our so-called nuclear umbrella. I agree with his analysis. Kim Jong-un may well believe his actions could cause U.S. policymakers to act in a more unilateral fashion, undermining the alliance. Kim may even believe that the U.S. would hesitate to come to South Korea's defense if the U.S. perceives that doing so could expose the U.S. to direct attack. Again, however, I believe Kim is making a fundamental miscalculation. If anything, the increasing threat to the U.S. homeland posed by North Korea should bring the United States and South Korea closer together, not drive a wedge between us, because our fates are so closely intertwined. U.S. policymakers must make crystal clear that the U.S. commitment to South Korea and the importance that Washington attaches to cooperation with Seoul is stronger than ever. As Victor and Jake Sullivan noted in a recent op-ed, North Korea is the land of lousy options. But those options only become worse if there's any real or perceived erosion in the U.S.-South Korea relationship. And that leads me to what I see as the second main challenge to the alliance, which is the changing and complex political dynamics in Washington and Seoul with the recent elections of President Trump and President Moon. Let me focus on the former. And I think it's safe to say that we have a significantly unconventional leader in the White House. When it comes to the Trump administration and its approach to the multifaceted U.S.-South Korea partnership, my concerns fall into two categories. First, I'm concerned about the apparent inability of the administration to nominate and secure Senate confirmation of qualified individuals to fill positions at state and defense responsible for policy towards Korea and East Asia. For example, nearly 8 months into this administration, there's no nominated U.S. ambassador to Seoul. There's no nominated assistant secretary in the State Department's Bureau of East Asia and Pacific Affairs. There's no undersecretary for arms control and international security. There's no special envoy for the North Korean human rights issues, and over at the Department of Defense, no individual has been nominated and confirmed for the position of Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asia and Pacific Affairs or Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia. I mean absolutely no disrespect to the individuals who may be holding these positions on an interim or acting basis. Some of them are excellent. But we all know that Senate confirmation provides enhanced credibility and stability. And when it comes to international affairs in general, and alliance preservation in particular, personnel is policy. I'm heartened that irresponsible individuals like Steve Bannon and Sebastian Gorka have departed the administration, and that experienced national security professionals like the White House Chief of Staff John Kelly, the Secretary of Defense James Mattis, and the National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster seem to be gaining in influence. Nevertheless, the fact remains that you need subject matter experts in place at every level in the national security bureaucracy to develop and execute policy, to reassure allies, and to deter adversaries. The administration has been severely lacking in this respect. My second concern about the Trump administration is this. Too many members of the administration, including the president himself, do not appreciate that the rhetoric they use and the actions they take to appeal to certain domestic political constituencies can cause relationships with foreign allies harm and therefore undermine our national security. Consider, for example, President Trump's initial reaction via Twitter to North Korea's most recent nuclear test. If there were an event whose gravity called for a thoughtful and deliberate and sober-minded response, not limited to 140 characters, this was it. Unfortunately, the president turned again to social media. And even more troubling than the medium through which he chose to deliver his message was the message itself. The president accused South Korea under President Moon of appeasement, evoking the historical memory of British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's failed effort to stop German aggression by agreeing to Hitler's demands. Use of such a loaded term may play well with a certain segment of the president's base, but it's hard to overstate just how false, how foolish, and how potentially damaging this claim can be. Here we are facing an unprecedented threat of military escalation by a rogue nuclear state, and the leader of the most powerful nation on earth chooses to Twitter shame and Twitter inflame our close ally. If one of North Korea's goals is to test the U.S.-South Korea alliance, as I believe it is, then Pyongyang must be positively gleeful over this Twitter exchange. I'm also worried by reports that the Trump administration, again with an eye to pleasing a domestic political audience, could announce that it intends to withdraw from Chorus FTA. This agreement was initiated and signed under the Bush 43 administration and was modified, finalized, and approved by Congress with bipartisan support under the Obama administration. The United States and Korea are major economic partners, and the United States is Korea's second largest trading partner after China, and Korea is the United States' seventh largest trading partner. The Chorus FTA is the centerpiece of this very important economic relationship. And my purpose here is not to defend every clause in Chorus FTA, although I do believe it is on net a beneficial agreement for both countries. Instead, I want to emphasize that both President Bush and President Obama saw the Chorus FTA as more than simply a trade deal. They also correctly viewed it as a vehicle to deepen and expand influence with a vital ally in a key region. China has an FTA with Korea, and for this and many other reasons, U.S. policymakers should want our economy and Korea's economy to be tied more closely together, not less. Against this backdrop, a unilateral decision by the United States to withdraw from this agreement, even if it's a tactical ploy to renegotiate aspects of the agreement, is likely to be seen by South Korea as a betrayal of America's commitment to the broader alliance at an incredibly precarious time. And if the United States can't be trusted to do business with South Korea on the basis of a mutual agreement negotiated by two presidents of both political parties, why should Korea believe our security assurances are real? I hope the Trump administration is asking itself hard questions like this, and that it will proceed with wisdom and care. Unfortunately, two characteristics I've seen in short supply this far in this administration. Let me close with a thought about the importance of U.S. leadership and the role of Congress in ensuring that our Congress does not retreat from its global responsibilities in an age of rising populism. You know, I understand why calls to put America first can resonate with hardworking families throughout the United States who are struggling here at home and who sincerely wonder why our country is spending precious taxpayer dollars on defense, diplomacy, and development abroad. At the same time, I firmly believe that the United States is safer, stronger, and more prosperous when our service members, our diplomats, our trade officials, and our aid workers are sufficiently numbered, adequately resourced, and deeply engaged with the world. The world's a better place when we work side by side with our partners in Asia and other regions, both to prevent conflict and to prepare ourselves to prevail should conflict occur. I have a little personal story to share how strongly I support this principle that the U.S. and global security flow from and depend on U.S. global engagement and leadership. You know, earlier this summer, I had a chance to host 10 six-year-olds from my son's kindergarten class, and that is bravery, just saying. They were visiting Washington, and we were walking towards the World War II Museum. And one of the little boys asked me, you know, Miss Stephanie, why hasn't there been a World War III? And, you know, I gave what I believe to be a truthful and perhaps not exactly age-appropriate response. You know, I told him there are two main reasons why we've not experienced direct and devastating conflict between major powers in the last 60 years. And the first is U.S. leadership around the world. And the second is the web of institutions and alliances that the United States and its partners in Asia and Europe established after World War II. And so rest assured, if this child grows up to be the next U.S. Pacific commander, I'll take credit. My experience on Capitol Hill has led me to believe that there's a strong bipartisan recognition in Congress that U.S. global engagement, leadership, and alliances matter, and matter a great deal. Which is good because I'm also of the view that Congress, as a co-equal branch of government and the one with the primary power of the purse, should not be timid about exercising its considerable authority when it comes to foreign policy. We should use the power conferred upon us by Article 1 of the Constitution and wield it in a way that is consistent with our long-standing national interest and values, ideally with the approval of the executive branch, but over its objections if necessary. If Congress sees the Trump administration take any step that would weaken our alliance with South Korea, Congress should step in. And with that, I'll wrap up here. I look forward to the Q&A, and thank you again for the invitation. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Congresswoman Murphy. She has agreed to take a few questions, again, despite this being the first day back from recess and a very full agenda. So I'll open the floor in a minute, let you think of a couple of questions. In the meantime, if I could ask you, Stephanie, there are, you know, Congress has been quite active on the North Korea issue, passing a lot of bills that have been, I think, arming the administration, whether it's Republican or Democrat, with the tools to move forward, particularly in terms of sanctioning. But in your discussion, I thought a very thoughtful discussion of North Korea, you mentioned that part of the solution is they have to recognize that their survival comes through negotiation, right? Some sort of negotiated settlement. And I guess the question then is, from your perspective and your colleagues, what does the Congress see in terms of that side of the equation, in terms of this question of negotiation and some sort of diplomatic settlement?
I think that there's general agreement that the best path forward is diplomatic. And so we have to exhaust all means possible in that. And I think one of the things is, though we have provided the tools on sanctions, there's still a level of uncertainty as to how well implemented those sanctions have been. It's why earlier this year I introduced a bill to call for a North Korea intel fusion cell. But within that, and the intel fusion cell would have all of the intel agencies work together. And CIA has since put together their own Intel Fusion Cell, but I do think it needs to be expanded. But within that bill, one of the areas of focus was to gather the information we need to know to ascertain whether or not how well these sanctions have been implemented and whether or not they're having an effect. I think, as you've said, people think sanctions don't work until they do, right? But it requires everybody being on board and actually executing on their piece of that. And so, I think we need to push forward and make sure that those sanctions are implemented to the full extent possible and see what other means we can apply to create pressure to encourage North Korea to come to the negotiating table.
That's great. The other place that Congress has played a very important role has been on human rights. I mean, the North Korean Human Rights Act, I think, is up for renewal pretty soon. There was a groundswell of interest in this issue with the UN Commission of Inquiry report a few years ago. To what extent does Congress, do you and your colleagues see yourselves playing a role and in what way would the act would be renewed? And what is the view on that? Because it seems to have, tension towards that issue seems to have dissipated in the past few months.
Well, I think one area that we have expressed through a letter to the administration is that appointment of that special envoy on human rights. And that had multiple co-signers. So I think that there still is an interest in seeing human rights addressed, and particularly because of the connection that you've often raised, which is that there's a connection between North Korea's human rights violations and the way that it's getting resources to fund some of its missile development.
Yes, thanks. Terrific. So let me open the floor now to questions. If you ask a question, please first tell us who you are, and then I think for the sake of our guest and for the audience, we'd appreciate questions rather than questions disguised as something else.
That's a hard task in DC.
Yeah,
it's like asking a politician to be brief.
We'll go to Rob Warren right here. Rob, wait for the mic, it's coming.
Congresswoman, thank you for an excellent address. President Trump has indicated that perhaps he's considering giving notice that he would withdraw from Chorus FTA. This is 6 months trigger, I believe. Would it be possible that the Congress could override him on this? You had bipartisan support overwhelmingly before for the Chorus. Do you think it would be again an initiative could be taken?
I think that withdrawal from Chorus would be a huge mistake. It has been beneficial to a lot of states across this country, and so I think there are members of Congress who are very deeply interested in seeing it continue. The ways in which, from a tactical perspective, that Congress could, if the president were to announce that, prevent it from happening is to put in an appropriations bill that no funds shall be used to implement a withdrawal from Chorus FTA. And so that would be one option on how Congress could intercept something like that.
Thanks. Yes. Here. Good morning. Mike is coming.
I'm Yoshi Komori of the Japanese newspaper, Sankei Shimbun. You stated in your speech that the Trump administration has yet to fill the many important positions for its policy toward Asia within their executive branch. In your observation, why? Why do you think that the reason is?
Well, we can go with conspiracy theory, or we can. I think that when it comes to the State Department, there have been a number of articles that have been written about the dismantling of that department. And I really believe that, if you look at your budget and your personnel policy, you'll see what your priorities are. And so I'm actually fearful that the lack of personnel appointments and also some of the funding cuts that I've seen in the diplomatic and development space is actually a reflection of where this administration's priorities are. But again, that's an area where I would disagree. Our tools of national power include diplomacy and intel and economics, not just military. So we can't just fully fund that and rely solely on that.
Yes, right here.
Yeah, Ken Meyercord, a TV producer. Yesterday, a representative of one of the member states of the UN made the following statement. When a rogue regime has a nuclear weapon and an ICBM pointed at you, you do not take steps to lower your guard. No one would do that. We certainly won't. Was the speaker a representative of the United States or North Korea? In case you haven't guessed, it was Nikki Haley, our representative. But if you pluralize nuclear weapon and ICBM, couldn't the North Koreans make the same statement with equal legitimacy?
Could you repeat the last part before?
Excuse me?
Could you repeat the last sentence? I'm sorry.
Couldn't the North Koreans make the same statement that Nikki Haley did with equal legitimacy?
I think that it's in North Korea's development of nuclear weapons and their missiles are in violation of international law. The U.S. possession of our weapons is not. So their development is in violation of international law.
Great, thank you. Yes. I'll go to this side in a second too. Yes, here.
Jung-ho Kim, visiting fellow at the U.S. Korea Institute at the Johns Hopkins University. The American handling of the Cuban issues look very interesting to me. The normalization with Cuba may be in danger or not. What kind of implication can I find from the Cuban case? Thank you.
At a time when North Korea is so aggressively advancing its nuclear weapons and its missile technology in violation of international law, it's hard to imagine some sort of return to normalization like with Cuba. I think those are very, very different scenarios. What North Korea is doing right now in the region is aggressively destabilizing, flaunting international norms. I think that moving to normalization without some sort of halt or some sort of agreement to roll back what they have done illegally would be a mistake.
Yeah, I feel like that quite often, for those of us who study this, people bring up Cuba, they bring up Iran, and try to draw parallels. And I think that, on the surface there may look like they're parallels, but if you look at it with any degree of detail, they're very different. In the Cuba case, the obvious difference is Cuba was not testing, as you said, was not on an aggressive testing campaign to threaten U.S. territory, which make the conditions for any sort of even internal discussion about a Cuba model very difficult, I think, at this time. So let me go over to this side of the room. I can't see behind this podium. Yes, ma'am, right there.
Christina Yoon, U.S. Air Force Legislative Fellow. I think in light of recent events, kind of the big elephant in the room is this question of South Korea nuclearizing South Korea. And earlier this year, President Trump has stated that he'd be open to considering a nuclearized South Korea or South Korea developing kind of nuclear capabilities. If you could please share with us kind of the pulse of the U.S. Congress on this particular issue.
You know, we have spent decades with a lot of efforts into non-proliferation and reducing nuclear weapons around the world. I don't think that necessarily in this, that we should allow what is going on here with North Korea to escalate and nuclearize the peninsula further. I think that's, I mean, the point of the collective deterrence or the nuclear umbrella is so that South Korea does not have to develop its own nuclear weapons. And so long as that commitment exists and is a firm commitment on the US part, there shouldn't be a need for South Korea to develop its own nuclear capabilities. But having said that, you know, there are a number of areas where it appears this administration is making some adjustments to South Korea's defensive capabilities. And we all understand that even those conventional weapons, those thresholds, payloads, things like that changing, creates a response by China and Russia. So we have to proceed very carefully how we allow our response to North Korea's actions to contribute to or take away from the stability of the region.
Could you, I mean, you just mentioned China. Could you say, you know, a little bit about your views on how you think China has been handling this, and whether you think that the administration's policy of having these secondary sanctions sort of in their back pocket to directly sanction and list Chinese companies and entities if the Chinese aren't cooperative, do you think that's a sound strategy? I mean, I'd love to hear your views on the China piece of this.
You know, I think China has a really important role to play here, and whether or not it's exercised its full range of ability to influence this situation, I think the answer to that is probably it's fallen short of its full range. Although Chinese government officials will tell you that we're overestimating China's power over North Korea. And so, you know, secondary sanctions are just to encourage China to think differently about it. But I wonder if this nuclear test doesn't make it think differently about its role. And I think it has to think both in terms of carrot and stick, right? So what we've been pushing China to do is, you know, sanction North Korea, make it painful for them, not to continue the Game of Thrones theme, but winter is coming on the Korean peninsula. And so one would imagine any sort of oil sanctions at this time would be particularly pronounced and felt strongly by North Korea. So I think that's the stick part of it, right? But what are the carrots that are available for Korea? And how do you look at what it is that North Korea is trying to achieve and see, you know, I don't know that the US is ever going to be able to assure North Korea that we won't topple them, right? No matter how many people say it. But can China provide some sort of assurances on that carrot side in addition to the sticks to get some traction in this scenario?
Yeah. The Game of Thrones one went over my head. I'm not a Game of Thrones person, but I'm sure like 99% of the people here are. Yeah, no offense to HBO or anything. Yeah. So, yes, let's take a question here.
Could you please stand up? I'm a journalist from Dongyeon Kim, and then I'm a journalist from Joseon in South Korea. I have two questions to you, and then first question is about the it's actually under this alliance. As part of the alliance, I would like to know that under Bush administration and the Trump's administration, what would be the commonalities and differences between the policies towards the Korean Peninsula? And the second question is about maybe since Dr. Chai is here today, you as the new nominated as a new ambassador to Korea, what would be your arrival date to the Korea as a new ambassador? I mean, it's a specific
That's
time.
News to
just
you,
wonders about maybe that's a question that which you can answer, or why has it been delayed so many positions that has been under this Trump administration, which you briefly touched on today, that there are many of the positions regarding the Asian issues are still empty. So I just want to know the reason that as well. Thank you.
You want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I'll give you a moment to accept your new position. Differences in the alliance. You know, as with many things with this administration, there's more rhetoric than actual substantive change in policy as of yet, right? Obviously, if we move forward with pulling out of Chorus, that would be a significant change in policy. But right now, we're just hearing a change in tone and tenor of how we're talking to a dear ally. But if you look at what we've done as a government, you know, in the NDAA that was passed, there's a significant investment in Asia security. We continue to do exercises with South Korea. I mean, all of the things that have been cornerstones of the alliance are continuing to date. But that's not to take that for granted that it will continue. But I think right now we're just trying to deal with a little bit of the rhetoric, and that's been the main change.
Well, great. Well, Stephanie, thank you so much for taking the time. I think your comments were extremely thoughtful. I know that you've traveled to the region and you are emerging as one of the leaders on Asia policy in Korea on the Hill. And again, knowing that this is your first day back and the agenda you have in front of you, we really do appreciate you taking the time to be with us. So, ladies and gentlemen, if we could thank the Congressman very much.
Thank you.